The 80s, filled with groove, funk, black Michael Jackson, and bright neon colors. It was also filled with a little something called the Satanic Panic. Those of you who are older will probably remember being in your room listening to bands like Black Sabbath and Judas Priest while your mother worried for your well-being, thinking that you were possessed by Satan himself. Like many others, your music delights were probably just that. Music you enjoyed listening to, and rightfully so. They are pretty good bands. Though we know these bands as being more dark and morbid, especially with their lyrics, people were hit with fear, believing that this music were causing their children to go have sex, do drugs, and well, why the fuck not, worship Satan himself. Now, of course, like previously mentioned, many kids weren't actually worshipping Satan, but rather listening to this new form of rock. But of course, there is always that one person that fucks it up for everyone else. This kid's name is Ricky Kasso. He actually named himself the Acid King for his obsession with, well, taking trips on a lot of hallucinogenic drugs. Ricky Kasso was actually the son of a history teacher who was also a football coach. But surprisingly, Ricky Kasso himself was a high school dropout. When he wasn't doing this, he frequented the library, where he came across books about witchcraft and Satanism, which is when he grew obsessed with the topic. So much so that he not only converted himself to that religion, but also his friends. This junkie and his group of junkie friends created an occult called the Knight of the Black Circle, where they dealt and used drugs, but also held satanic rituals. One of their most known rituals took place in the Amityville house, where they celebrated this. If you didn't know, this house was actually the place where a man by the name of Roy DeFaro murdered his parents and his 4 siblings. You know, the typical place you want to hold your cult rituals. This kind of lifestyle led him to a darker path, one that became an icon of the Satanic Panic era. On June 16th of 1984, Ricky and his friends decided to hike into North Port Azteca Woods, a place they frequently visited to do what they love, drugs. Busting out some acid, they all began their trip, and it was in this trip that something dark sparked inside the mind of Ricky Kasso. Now, we all know that acid causes you to see things, but it can also cause auditory hallucinations. What Ricky Kasso claimed that day was that Satan told him to kill his friend, Gary Lors, because he had apparently stolen some PCP, and well, that just didn't sit well with him. They had altercations in the past, but this trip into the woods was to put all those arguments aside. When they wanted to start a fire in the woods, they apparently couldn't start it because everything was too wet. So Ricky Kasso suggested that they use Lor's hair as kindling, but of course, this sparked another argument, and things got worse from there. The argument kept escalating, and soon a fight arose, and Ricky Kasso pulled out a knife and began to stab Gary Lors, as his 2 friends, Jimmy Troiano and Albert Quinones, held him down and prevented him from running away. While stabbing him, Ricky Kasso stated that he heard a crow, and that in his mind, that was Satan approving of his decision to kill his friend, Gary Lors. As Ricky Kasso continued stabbing Gary Lors, he commanded him to say you love Satan. But Gary never did. Instead, he said, I love my mother. Ricky Kasso's stabbing spree continued until Gary Lors was thought to be dead. Then afterwards, they covered his body with twigs and leaves. While they were walking away, Gary Lors sat up and again repeated, I love my mother. Ricky Kasso went back and continued stabbing and beating Gary until he was sure he was dead. Honestly, you gotta give it to the kid. It's pretty fucking badass what he did. What was left of this crime was Gary Lors' dead body with around 16 to 36 stab wounds, with his eyes gouged out and rocks and stones shoved down his throat. Though these kids were not discreet about their crimes, they actually bragged about it, and even took people to see Gary Lors' decomposing body. Yet, no one said anything. For 2 weeks, actually. You're probably thinking, why didn't Gary Lors' parents report their son missing? Well, here's the thing. Gary Lors was a constant runaway. So, when he suddenly went missing, his parents didn't think much of it. It was only when an anonymous tip was given to police that he was found. At first, however, they thought it was a prank call, because no one had even mentioned or reported Gary Lohr is missing. They thankfully later verified the calls and went to the location where the murder took place. But the teens by now had fled the crime scene, and two of them, Ricky Kasso and Jimmy Toriano, had moved out of town and were headed west to California. They did this by buying a used car from a junkyard for $50. Before they left, however, they buried Gary's body, but as they were kicking him to his grave, they claimed that his head just kind of fell off due to the decomposure of his body. Soon they returned to their hometown and partied with their friends, but the morning after, they were finally caught when someone called about a suspicious car, which is the car they were sleeping in. When they were caught, a picture was taken of Ricky Kasso while he was wearing a band tee of AC/DC. It was because of this that the media immediately linked this case to Satanism and cult rituals. The story grew in popularity, and people all over the world were hearing about this horrific crime, though the residents of the community had a different idea of what actually happened.
It wasn't a cult. There was just a group of kids that came down here that, were basically castaways, and they gave this town a bad name.
They said they had bonfires and they held satanic rituals around. That wasn't true.
Even Police Chief Robert Howard, who's lived here for 20 years, doesn't believe it.
I don't believe there was a cult. There was 2 or 3 people who walked around with satanic literature, who said or professed a belief in Satan, who said they practiced satanic worship. It's garbage.
Ricky Kasso's trial was soon to come, and he would have most likely been convicted of murder and plenty of other charges, though this trial never happened. This was because he hung himself with the bedsheets while in jail, leaving only his 2 buddies to deal with the trial. Though they were never actually convicted of their crimes, because they agreed to be prosecution witnesses only in exchange for immunity of their crimes. To put it very simply, they were never charged or convicted with a crime of murder. Pretty crazy to think that the criminal justice system actually let them go with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. Pretty scary to know that they're still actually out there in the streets, and maybe even be someone you interact with, your neighbor, coworker, friend. Anyways, thank you guys all very much for watching, and stay safe out there, because some people are just fucking awful.